I remember the first time I saw him testify. It was March 1951, and America was watching. Not watching his face, the television cameras weren't allowed to show that, but watching his hands. Nervous, fidgeting hands that rubbed together, twisted a handkerchief, drummed on the table. Those hands belonged to Frank Costello, and they told a story of tension, of a man under pressure unlike anything he'd faced before. Senator Estes Kefauver and his committee were investigating organized crime in America, and they'd called the most powerful mob boss in the country to testify. For 3 days, Americans watched those hands. They listened to his raspy voice, damaged, some said, from childhood surgery, as he answered questions evasively, deflected accusations, claimed ignorance. And then, on the third day, something unprecedented happened. Frank Costello walked out. "Am I under arrest?" he demanded. "No," replied the committee's counsel. "That I am walking out," Costello said, and he did. "My name is Robert. I worked as a political aide in New York City from 1945 to 1965, handling campaign logistics, fundraising, voter coordination. My job brought me into contact with Tammany Hall, the Democratic Party machine that controlled New York politics. And through Tammany, I met Frank Costello. Not in a dark alley or a smoky social club, but at a fundraiser for a mayoral candidate. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, talking politics and city contracts with the same ease that other people discussed the weather. If you didn't know who he was, and many people there didn't, you'd think he was just another successful businessman. That was Frank's genius. While other mob bosses built empires through violence and intimidation, Frank built his through connections, diplomacy, and an understanding that real power came not from the gun, but from knowing who to call when you needed something done. This is the story of Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the Underworld, the man who showed the Mafia that politics could be more profitable than bootlegging, that influence could be more powerful than fear, and that sometimes the smartest move is walking away. The Immigrant. Francesco Castiglia was born on January 26, 1891, in Lauropoli, Calabria, Italy. His family immigrated to New York in 1895, settling in East Harlem when Frank was 4 years old. Like so many immigrant families, the Castiglias were poor. Frank's father worked as a laborer, his mother took in laundry. There were limited opportunities for Italian immigrants in turn-of-the-century New York. Discrimination, language barriers, poverty that seemed inescapable. Frank dropped out of school early and turned to petty crime. Small-time theft, street gang activities, the usual path for poor kids in immigrant neighborhoods. In 1908, at age 17, he was arrested for assault and robbery. He served 10 months in jail. That jail sentence taught Frank something crucial. Violence had consequences. Getting caught was bad for business. And most importantly, there were smarter ways to make money and build power. After his release, he decided his wits were more powerful than bullets. He would never carry a gun again. By the 1920s, Frank had changed his name to Frank Costello and was working in bootlegging with a young gangster named Charles Luciano, later known as Lucky Luciano. Prohibition had turned alcohol smuggling into a multi-million-dollar business, and Frank was perfectly positioned to profit. But while other bootleggers focused on production and distribution, Frank saw a bigger opportunity: political protection. The political machine. To understand Frank Costello's rise, you need to understand Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was the Democratic Party organization that controlled New York City politics from the mid-1800s through the 1960s. It was a political machine in the truest sense, a hierarchical organization that traded jobs, contracts, and favors for votes and loyalty. For immigrants, especially Irish and later Italian immigrants, Tammany Hall represented a path to power and legitimacy. If you wanted a city job, you went to your Tammany district leader. If you needed help with legal trouble, Tammany could connect you with a judge. If you wanted to open a business, Tammany controlled the permits and licenses. Frank understood this system intimately, and he realized that if you controlled Tammany Hall, you controlled New York City. He started cultivating relationships with Tammany politicians in the 1920s. Campaign contributions, fundraising help, assistance with voter turnout, Frank provided all of it. And in return, he gained access. By the 1930s, Frank Costello had become one of the most influential figures in New York politics, despite never holding elected office. Before a judge could be appointed, the decision had to be cleared with Frank. When Tammany needed to elect a new leader, Frank's support was essential. In 1942, Michael Kennedy wanted to become leader of Tammany Hall. He met with Frank Costello and secured his support. Kennedy was elected leader, and Frank's political backing became obviously important. It was an extraordinary arrangement. A man who made his fortune through illegal gambling and bootlegging now wielded enormous influence over the legitimate government of America's largest city. I saw this firsthand in the late 1940s when I was working on a city council campaign. Our candidate needed support from certain district leaders, and someone suggested we talk to Frank. I was shocked. This was supposed to be a legitimate political campaign, and we were consulting with an organized crime figure. But that's how it worked. Frank wasn't just part of the system. In many ways, he was the system. His money funded campaigns, his connections determined appointments, his influence shaped policy. And he did it all, quietly, diplomatically, without the violence that characterized other mob bosses.
The Commission. In 1931, a war ended and a new era began. The Castellamare War had torn through New York's Italian organized crime world for 2 years. Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano fought for control, both trying to become boss of bosses, both clinging to old world traditions. Lucky Luciano, Frank's partner and friend, had a different vision. He arranged for Masseria to be murdered, then waited 5 months and helped arrange Maranzano's death as well. But instead of declaring himself boss of bosses, Lucky did something revolutionary. He created the Commission. The Commission was Organized Crime's board of directors. The 5 New York families, plus the Chicago outfit and the Buffalo family, would each have representation. Major decisions would be made collectively. Disputes would be mediated. The endless wars that had plagued organized crime would be replaced by negotiation and compromise. It was exactly Frank Costello's style. Diplomacy instead of violence, business instead of warfare, long-term thinking instead of impulsive reactions. Frank became one of the Commission's most influential members. His political connections, his gambling operations, his diplomatic skills, all of it made him invaluable. In 1936, Lucky Luciano was convicted on prostitution charges and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. Frank Costello became acting boss of what would later be known as the Genovese crime family. He was 45 years old and the most powerful mob boss in America. The Slot Machine King. While Frank's political power was growing, he was also building a massive gambling empire. In the early 1930s, Frank controlled thousands of slot machines in New York City. They were everywhere: bars, restaurants, social clubs. Each machine generated steady income, and with thousands of machines operating, the profits were enormous. But in 1934, Mayor Fiore LaGuardia launched a crusade against slot machines. He personally took a sledgehammer to machines in photo opportunities for the press. He ordered police raids. He made eliminating slot machines a priority of his administration. Most mobsters would have fought back. They would have bribed more police, intimidated politicians, used violence to protect their operations. Frank did something smarter. he moved the machines to Louisiana. Huey Long, the populist demagogue who ran Louisiana like a personal fiefdom, needed money for his political machine. Frank offered him a deal. The slot machines could operate in Louisiana, and Long would take 10% of the profits. Long agreed. Suddenly, Louisiana was flooded with slot machines. They were in restaurants, grocery stores, liquor stores, practically every business in the state. The state even imposed a $100 annual tax on each machine, even though they weren't technically legal. It was brilliant. Frank had turned a political problem in New York into a massive profit opportunity in Louisiana, and he'd done it without violence, without confrontation, just through strategic negotiation. That was always Frank's way. Find the path of least resistance, work with the system rather than against it, turn problems into opportunities. Alongside the Louisiana operation, Frank expanded gambling nationally and internationally. He worked with Meyer Lansky, the financial genius who handled money laundering and offshore operations, to establish casinos in Florida and Cuba. He standardized the system of taking and distributing bets among bookies, not just in New York, but across the country. When Prohibition ended in 1933, many mobsters scrambled to find new sources of income. Frank had already solved that problem. His gambling empire was generating more money than bootlegging ever had, and it was national in scope.
The fundraiser. In 1949, Frank Costello did something extraordinary. He hosted a fundraiser at the Copacabana, the famous nightclub he secretly controlled, for the Salvation Army. Congressmen attended, senators showed up, judges came. They all had to be there because Frank had invited them. It was Frank's attempt to legitimize himself, to present himself as a philanthropist and community leader rather than a crime boss. He wanted to be seen as a legitimate citizen. But it backfired. When word leaked out that Frank Costello had thrown a Salvation Army fundraiser, the scandal was enormous. How could elected officials and judges attend an event hosted by a known mobster? The incident revealed something crucial about Frank's position. He had his foot in two worlds. On one side, he was acting boss of the Luciano family, a member of the Commission, a major organized crime figure. On the other side, he was politically powerful, connected to Tammany Hall and Democratic Party leaders, able to influence government decisions. The problem was that these two worlds couldn't be fully reconciled. No matter how many fundraisers he hosted, no matter how respectable he tried to appear, Frank couldn't erase his criminal past. The money for his political influence came from bootlegging and gambling. Behind his diplomatic style was always the implicit threat of violence. I attended that fundraiser. I remember watching Frank work the room, shaking hands, chatting with judges and politicians, playing the role of successful businessman and community leader. He was good at it, charming, sophisticated, well-spoken. But also at that party was Vito Genovese. Genovese was everything Frank wasn't: violent, ruthless, hungry for power through fear rather than influence. He represented the old way, the Sicilian tradition of bosses who ruled through intimidation. And Genovese wanted what Frank had. The Kefauver Committee. In 1950, Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee launched an investigation into organized crime in America. The Kefauver Committee, as it became known, was the first major televised congressional hearing. Americans across the country watched as mobsters, politicians, and law enforcement officials testified about the extent of organized crime's influence. In March 1951,
The committee called Frank Costello to testify. Frank didn't want to appear. He knew that televised testimony would expose him to public scrutiny, would make his face recognizable to millions of Americans. Everything about his style, the quiet influence, the behind-the-scenes power, the diplomatic approach, depended on remaining relatively unknown. But he was under subpoena. He had to testify. His lawyers negotiated a compromise. Frank would testify, but the cameras wouldn't show his face. They would only show his hands. For 3 days in mid-March 1951, Frank Costello testified before the Kefauver Committee. America watched those nervous, fidgeting hands as he answered questions. The questions were aggressive. What was his net worth? How did he make his money? What was his relationship with politicians, with judges, with Tammany Hall? Frank's answers were evasive, even hostile. He claimed he couldn't remember details. He refused to discuss his finances. He denied having improper relationships with public officials. The committee wasn't satisfied. On the 3rd day, they pressed him about his relationship with William O'Dwyer, the former Brooklyn district attorney who'd prosecuted Murder Inc. cases. They asked about his net worth. Frank had had enough.
"I have acute laryngotracheitis," his lawyer announced, producing a doctor's note recommending bed rest. "You refuse to testify further?" Kefauver asked. "Absolutely," Frank declared. "Am I under arrest?" "No," the counsel replied. "Then I am walking out," Frank said. And he did. Despite being under subpoena, despite the warnings that leaving would be contempt of court, Frank Costello stood up and walked out of the hearing room. It was a defining moment. Frank had built his career on working within the system, on using the rules to his advantage. But when the system turned against him, when cooperation meant exposure and humiliation, he chose defiance. The committee filed 11 contempt charges. In January 1952, Frank was brought to trial. The first jury deadlocked, but a second jury convicted him on 10 counts. He was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, plus a $5,000 fine. On August 15, 1952, Frank surrendered to U.S. Marshal Tom Farley. "Tell the boys I have come in to do my bit," he announced to reporters. "I don't want no favors from nobody. I want it to be treated like everybody else." He served 14 months before being released in October 1953. The Kefauver hearings had exposed Frank Costello to the American public. No longer could he operate in the shadows. His face, or at least his hands, were known to millions. His political connections were now a matter of public record. His influence had been severely damaged. And Vito Genovese saw an opportunity: the assassination attempt. Vito Genovese had been in exile in Italy during World War II, but returned to New York in the late 1940s, determined to take control. He saw Frank as weak. Frank's diplomacy, his political connections, his preference for negotiation over violence. Genovese viewed all of it as soft, as a betrayal of traditional Sicilian Mafia values. Genovese wanted the old way: fear, force, unquestioned loyalty, the iron hand. He saw Frank's diplomacy as weakness. He saw himself as the future. In early 1957, Genovese made his move. On May 2, 1957, Frank Costello returned to his apartment building at 115 Central Park West around 11 p.m. He entered the lobby, nodded to the doorman, and headed toward the elevators. Behind him, a man entered the building, Vincent, the Chin Gigante, a Genovese soldier. "This is for you, Frank," Gigante said. A gunshot echoed through the lobby. The bullet whistled past Frank's head, then a sound like a hammer cracking marble. Frank stumbled backward, clutching his head. Blood trickled down his temple.
The bullet had grazed him, an inch from his brain, 1 inch. Some said his hat was tilted just enough. Some said the bullet deflected off bone. Some said Frank ducked at the last second. Whatever the truth, one fact echoed through every corner of the underworld. Frank Costello had survived.
And survival in the Mafia carried its own kind of power. The doorman identified Gigante as the shooter, but when prosecutors brought charges, Frank testified that he couldn't identify his assailant. Gigante was acquitted. Why would Frank refuse to identify the man who tried to kill him? Because he'd made a decision. He was done. The next morning, Frank did something unthinkable. He didn't seek revenge. He didn't rally soldiers. He didn't demand justice. He didn't even name a suspect. Instead, he stepped down, quietly, without a fight, without a bullet in return. He told his closest lieutenants, "I've had enough." Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the Underworld, the most powerful mob boss in America, retired. He was 66 years old. He'd spent 40 years in organized crime. He'd built a political empire, controlled gambling operations across the country, wielded enormous influence, and he walked away from all of it. Some people said it was cowardice. Others said it was wisdom. Frank himself never explained his reasoning. But here's what happened next. In November 1957, 6 months after shooting Frank, Vito Genovese called a meeting at Appalachian, New York. About 100 mob bosses attended. The meeting was supposed to legitimize Genovese's power, to have him officially recognized as the most powerful boss in America. The police raided the meeting. Dozens of mobsters fled into the woods. It was a disaster, a humiliation that made national headlines. 2 years later, in 1959, Vito Genovese was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison on drug charges. The underworld buzzed with one theory. Frank had let Genovese win so Genovese could hang himself. A peaceful retreat or the most elegant revenge in mob history? I think it was both. Frank was genuinely tired of the life, tired of the violence and the investigations and the constant pressure. But he was also smart enough to know that Genovese would overreach, that his violent style would attract law enforcement attention, that sometimes the best revenge is just waiting for your enemy to destroy himself. Frank Costello walked away. Vito Genovese went to prison and died there, and Frank lived another 16 years in peaceful retirement. The retirement years. From 1957 until his death in 1973, Frank Costello lived quietly in New York. He was still known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld. He still retained power and influence. Mob bosses still came to him for advice. He maintained his friendships with Lucky Luciano, who died in Italy in 1962, and Meyer Lansky. But he was no longer active in running criminal operations. He'd stepped away, officially retired, turned his attention to legitimate business interests and his personal life. In 1961, his citizenship was stripped from him due to his criminal record. He was technically subject to deportation, but continued to live in New York. His legal troubles continued. All those years of legal battles had drained his bank account. The man who'd once controlled millions in gambling operations found himself asking friends for loans. But he was free. He wasn't in prison like Vito Genovese. He wasn't dead like Albert Anastasia. He wasn't in exile like Lucky Luciano. He was living in New York, the city he'd called home since he was 4 years old. I saw Frank occasionally during those years. He'd show up at certain restaurants, certain social events. He was older, quieter, but still carried himself with dignity. The last time I saw him was in 1972 at a dinner for retired Tammany Hall politicians. He looked frail, his health clearly failing, but he was there, still connected to the political world he'd influenced for so long.
We didn't talk much. What was there to say? He lived an extraordinary life, built power in both the criminal underworld and legitimate politics, survived assassination attempts and congressional investigations, and had the rare privilege of retiring on his own terms. On February 18, 1973, Frank Costello suffered a heart attack at his home in Manhattan. He was rushed to doctor's hospital. The doctors did everything they could, but Frank Costello died that day. He was 82 years old. He had a quiet, dignified memorial service at a funeral home in Manhattan. It was attended by 50 friends, relatives, and law enforcement officials. He was laid to rest in a private mausoleum at St. Michael's Cemetery in East Elmhurst, Queens. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the Underworld, died peacefully of natural causes. He became one of the only mob bosses to live a peaceful life and die of old age. That, more than anything, defines his legacy. The diplomat's legacy. I'm 94 years old now, one of the last people alive who knew Frank Costello personally. When I think about his life, I think about the fundamental lesson he understood that so many other mobsters didn't. Power doesn't have to come from violence. Meyer Lansky understood this. He built his empire through financial sophistication. Carlo Gambino understood this. He ruled through quiet strategy. Frank Costello understood this better than almost anyone. He built his power through political connections and diplomatic skills. Compare Frank's life to other mob bosses of his era. Al Capone died at 48, destroyed by syphilis in prison. Lucky Luciano died in exile, never allowed to return to America. Vito Genovese died in prison. Albert Anastasia was murdered in a barber shop. Paul Castellano was gunned down on a Manhattan street. John Gotti died in a federal prison cell. Frank Costello died peacefully at age 82, at home, surrounded by friends and family. That's the power of diplomacy. That's the advantage of working within the system rather than against it. That's the wisdom of knowing when to walk away. Frank's approach wasn't perfect. He was still a criminal, still built his wealth through illegal gambling and bootlegging. He corrupted politicians and judges, undermined democratic institutions, profited from human weakness. But he did it with far less violence than other mob bosses. He preferred negotiation to intimidation. He saw warfare as expensive and counterproductive. He understood that sustainable power came from relationships and influence, not from fear. In that sense, Frank Costello represented a different kind of organized crime, less brutal, more sophisticated, more integrated into legitimate society. It was the model that Meyer Lansky perfected on the financial side, treating crime like a business, applying corporate principles, thinking long-term. And it worked. Frank lived longer and died more peacefully than almost any of his peers.
The two worlds. The fundamental contradiction of Frank Costello's life was that he had his foot in two worlds that couldn't be reconciled. In one world, he was a respected figure, connected to politicians, friendly with judges, hosting fundraisers for charity. In that world, he was Frank Costello, successful businessman and community leader. In the other world, he was a mob boss, acting head of the Luciano family, member of the commission, controller of gambling operations. In that world, he was Frank Costello, organized crime figure. He tried to legitimize himself. The Salvation Army fundraiser was just one example. He presented himself as a businessman, a philanthropist, someone who transcended his criminal past. But it never fully worked. The criminal past was always there. The source of his wealth was always clear. The implicit threat behind his political influence was always understood.
The Kefauver hearings exposed this contradiction to the American public. How could Frank Costello be both a legitimate businessman and a major organized crime figure? How could he have such close relationships with politicians and judges while running illegal gambling operations? The answer was that American society in the mid-20th century was more corrupt and compromised than comfortable people wanted to admit. The lines between legitimate and illegitimate business were blurry. Money from bootlegging and gambling flowed into political campaigns. Mobsters sat in hotel suites with elected officials. Frank Costello didn't create that corruption. He just understood it better than most people and used it more effectively. When he retired in 1957, he was stepping back from both worlds. He couldn't be a mob boss anymore. Genovese had taken that from him. But he also couldn't be a legitimate businessman. The Kefauver hearings had destroyed that possibility. So he became something else, a retired elder statesman of organized crime, someone whose advice was still valued, but whose active involvement was finished. And in that role, he found peace. The last lesson. If Frank Costello could speak to us now, what would he say? I think he'd say that violence is overrated, that diplomacy and connections are more valuable than guns, that knowing when to walk away is more important than knowing how to fight. He'd say that sustainable power comes from relationships, not from fear, that working within the system is smarter than fighting against it, that patience and strategic thinking beat impulsive reactions. He'd probably also admit that his attempt to legitimize himself failed, that you can't fully escape your past, that the two worlds, criminal and legitimate, can touch but never fully merge. But he'd also point out that he lived to 82 and died peacefully, that he retired on his own terms, that he survived assassination attempts, congressional investigations, and mob wars, that he built an empire and then had the wisdom to walk away from it. How many mob bosses could say that? The Prime Minister of the Underworld. The title was perfect. Not the boss of bosses, Frank never wanted that. Not the most violent or the most feared, but the most connected, the most politically powerful, the most diplomatic. He showed the Mafia a different path. Not everyone followed it. Men like Vito Genovese and John Gotti preferred violence and spectacle. But those who did follow Frank's example, the strategic thinkers, the diplomatic operators, the men who understood that real power is often invisible, they lasted longer and died better. Frank Costello's legacy isn't the gambling empire, or the political connections, or the commission meetings. It's the lesson that intelligence and diplomacy can be more powerful than violence. That sustainable success comes from working within systems, not destroying them. That knowing when to walk away is the ultimate form of strength. The diplomat understood what so many others didn't. The goal wasn't to be the most feared, it was to be the most effective. And effectiveness, in the long run, meant survival. Frank Costello survived, and then he died peacefully, decades after most of his peers were already gone. That's the power of diplomacy. That's the wisdom of the Prime Minister. And that's why 70 years after his retirement, and more than 50 years after his death, Frank Costello remains one of the most fascinating figures in organized crime history. Not because he was the most violent, but because he proved you didn't have to be.